So earlier this morning, we heard about the infrastructure of technology in our cities. And I'm beginning to understand it's more than just a nuanced difference, that you really have two issues around technology. One is the infrastructure that we talked about this morning, and the other is really data, which is a separate topic and a separate issue, but dynamic in that it's bringing new perspective in how we understand and how we manage our cities. Data is a very dynamic new force that brings with it the opportunity for innovation and change like never before. So the next session panel will be looking at how data will really change the shape and the future of cities. It should be a very exciting and engaging conversation. Please meet the panelists. First, the Research Director for Smarter Cities at IEC, Ruth B. Clark. And from New York, the executive at the Energy and Environment at IBM, excuse me, let me do this differently. From IBM, an executive with the Energy and Environment there is Florence Hudson. Florence, you may want to help us with that title. That didn't sound quite right. What is your title? Say that one more time. Director of Corporate Strategy and Energy and Environment. That's much better at IBM. We've heard of IBM. And also from New York City, Director of Analytics, Michael Flowers. From London, CEO and co-founder of Quantum Black, Simon Williams. Our panel chair is the Director of the Center for Urban Science and Progress here at NYU, Konstantin Konakasta. Welcome all, and look forward to your discussion. Oh, Deputy Director. I gave him a promotion.
No additional pay.
No additional compensation. In fact, with the better title, you actually take a pay cut.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be part of this conference, this two-day event. It's been a really enlightening day and a half, and hopefully we'll continue that today with this session. So it's a pleasure to share the stage with the people who are really kind of leading the discussion around big data analytics, about the use of information, not only with cities, but also in other sectors that we'll hear about. And I think just to set the stage a little bit, what I think everyone's come to realize, especially if not after the past sessions and speakers, that the kind of the pace of global urbanization has made it so that if we're going to tackle and address some of our kind of most pressing challenges, it's going to happen in cities. This is where we're going to actually kind of meet some of these and confront some of these problems head on. And what we're also realizing, I think, especially in New York, is that you can't build your way out of a lot of these quality of life problems and of kind of making cities function better. We see with the Second Avenue subway, which depending on when you count the start date of that project, somewhere between 10 and 50 years, we don't have that kind of time if we're looking at resource constraints, climate change, and just public health issues and other critical infrastructure issues. So this idea about using information analytics to optimize systems to improve the functioning of existing infrastructure and this kind of sense, model, intervene paradigm has a lot of power. And I think equally important is the power of people to empower people to make better decisions. So what I'd like to do as we start in with the discussion is just kind of begin a little bit, allow each panelist just to kind of frame the work that they're doing in this space and maybe I think it'd be really helpful to give an example or two of an implementation, of a project, of a use of information in a city that actually kind of made a difference. So Ruth B., why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks. So I'm Ruth B. Essner-Clark. I'm the director of our Global Smart City Strategies practice at IDC. And basically what I do is I write research about city strategies for cities and for the vendors that serve them to help them sort of move on their path to being, what we're calling a smart city. An unfortunate title, but I think we all sort of know what we're talking about there. And obviously part of being more intelligent is to be able to make data-driven decisions. The holy grail really around data is looking at prevention and prediction by using data and data modeling. And so there's some challenges to getting there. So what we see talking to a lot of the cities, and maybe one's not as sophisticated as New York, but how do they identify where they are, and how do they get to where they want to be? So we do a lot of discussions around road mapping and looking at frameworks for how cities can look at themselves. And we really focus on sort of 5 areas: intent, people, process, technology, and data, all sort of in coordination that have to be used for a data-driven strategy. And some interesting examples, I think, there's sort of two sides to data. One is looking at using analytics and big data to make decisions. And also then the other side is sort of the open data and transparency movement, which is really about citizen engagement. So we think we see a lot of interesting examples in New York with their Big Ideas challenges, and they're engaging the citizens around using their data, their sort of single version of the truth with their open data strategies. And I think the city of Atlanta is actually a really good example of using some of that analytics in their integrated predictive policing, which I think has reduced their crime rate about 40% compared to the national average of 20%, which has really been focused on integrating video analytics and doing a lot of things in that area. So those are two interesting examples.
Great, thank you. Simon?
Good morning, I'm Simon Williams. I'm Chief Executive and one of the co-founders of Quantum Black, which is a data science firm based out of London. So we specialize in data and turning, using data to help people gain new intelligence, craft their strategic response to that intelligence, and then build out the capability in order to deliver that response. By no means are we city experts. We work across multiple sectors, from aerospace to media to sport, which is perhaps some of our most glamorous stuff. And we've recently been translating a lot of what we've learned from how to instrument engines and use that to change your business model, through to how to take telematics off a race car and make real-time strategic decisions, and use sort of the techniques and the thinking around that in a city environment, specifically Crossrail in London. We've been using some of those techniques to help improve the instrumentation and monitoring program on the $28 billion Crossrail investment, as they're digging rather large tunnels under some of the world's most valuable real estate in the world.
Great.
And so I'm Florence Hudson, and I'm with IBM, and I have a great job. And I work in corporate strategy, and I help craft our new business strategies. Smarter Planet is one of them. Smarter Cities is part of that. I created our Smarter Building strategy, Smarter Water. I also work on cloud computing, business analytics and optimization, and our growth markets initiatives. And regarding energy and environment, what I do is help us craft our strategies, but more importantly, work with clients and with business partners so we can actually help them use data from the point of measuring, monitoring, modeling, and then managing. You have to have real data to be able to manage things. You have to know where you are and where you want to go. You do analytics to look at how you can optimize the system. How can you make the outcomes better? Some examples of that would be in Stockholm, Sweden. We've done some smart, we use the word smarter a lot, so I guess a number of us will. It's better to be smarter than not smarter, the way I look at it. So smarter transportation systems in Stockholm, Sweden, where they wanted to reduce traffic congestion and also improve the environment by working with different partners, leveraging some actually research analytics we had that optimized optical character recognition, so you could see the license plates trying to fly through and not pay, the tolling, and actually managing different tolling systems so that you would do congestion pricing. So when there's traffic congestion, you charge more for people to drive, and so they don't. So they had to increase, mass transportation, but the citizens loved it. They ended up reducing traffic congestion up to 25%. Very interestingly, reduced carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide emissions by 10 to 40%, depending on where you looked in the city, depending on where the congestion used to be. We're working with cities like Rio with a capability we have called Deep Thunder, which actually does weather prediction down to a kilometer level. As they're looking at the World Cup and the Olympics coming there, they want to be able to predict where there might be more flooding, where there might be challenges, where there could be landslides, so that they can have a safer environment. And I'll talk about some of the other examples in reducing building energy or water use by 10 to 40%, water management in like Washington, D.C., and some other places.
Great, thank you, Florence.
I'm Mike Flowers. I'm New York City's Chief Analytics Officer, which is really just kind of a overblown way of saying that my job is to try to get the city's arms around what it knows and then do something with it. Effectively, what we try to do as the city is kind of take advantage of the giant job we've got. And what that means is, so we regulate your streets, we make sure that the water that comes out of your tap is clean, we police them, we make sure that the structures aren't going to collapse, we put out your fires, we send ambulances to your houses, we collect taxes, we make sure that the boiler in your basement isn't going to blow up. and we license all the businesses in town, including restaurants and everything else, and then we pick up your trash. So that generates a tremendous amount of information, and that means that we have multiple touch points on the citizenry and its locations and its businesses that we are now leveraging to do a better job of it so that we don't have to raise your taxes in delivering those services I just described. You know, the recession happened, and I know that people seem to think that it's over, but it's still not over in New York City. And that means that, you know, the usual approach of we'll hire more people or throw more money at a problem isn't going to really fly this time. So we have to take the dollars we've got and allocate them more effectively. The best example I can, you know, publicly talk about right now is the one I've publicly talked about ad nauseum, and has to do with building inspections. So by way of example, the Department of Buildings, which does structural integrity inspections around the city, has roughly 200 inspectors to throw at our million structures for any of the, you know, 60-some-odd thousand complaints a day that the city of New York gets. And we are a complaint-driven town, and New Yorkers like to complain. So, you know, we have to point them where they're going to do the most good as defined by making sure that we are compliant with the regulations. Those regulations are in place to preserve public safety. So we want to send them to the most unsafe spots, which means we can now leverage that information on behalf of determining, you know, when we say risk, I mean risk of a catastrophic safety event. So by way of example, we found by taking all of this information that we have, that if there's a tax lien on your property, that property is 9 times more likely to sustain a structural fire. I have no idea what the causation between those two is, if any. I'm sure it has a lot to do. I mean, I think a lot of it's commonsensical. If you're broke, you're going to treat your property like crap. But the fact is that, you know, that's a good tell for us. So that tells me where to send my inspector. I look at that property, we get a complaint on it, I send an inspector out there over that other one in that million building pool, and we're going to have a result. That result is going to be that we're going to find conditions that are unsafe and remediate them. So that's how we are using data, as well as, you know, our you know, insight and human understanding and the experience of our 300,000 employees to deliver services more efficiently and effectively.
Great, thanks, Mike. So you kind of raised the next topic, which is you talked about multiple touch points. So obviously, I think to use data most effectively, it's when it starts getting most sensitive in a lot of respects. So it's really hard to separate the discussion of how we use information to improve decision making from the questions of transparency versus privacy and security. So I'll open this up to the panel in terms of kind of, especially in light of what's been going on over the past week or so, how do we balance, how big a problem is the privacy issue that we're talking about, especially when we talk about cities and personal information, versus balancing that with transparency and the ability to have open data?
Well, I mean, if I could speak as the government actor here, sure. Right? I mean, because this is something that really matters to us. You know, there's two things going on here. A, the dirty little secret is that about 99% of what we play with is publicly available, right? So, I mean, publicly available takes on different meanings in terms of how accessible it is. It's one thing to be able to go to say it's publicly available, which means you've got to go down to the Richmond County Clerk's office, open up a giant drawer and look through musty paper, yeah. But that's publicly available. You know, versus can I get a CSV dump of every property in town, yeah. Or generated by whatever agency for whatever widget it delivers. So there's that component of it. There are a very, very small number of things that aren't publicly available that we analyze. Those things aren't publicly available for very good reasons. For example, the fact that I send an ambulance to your house is a HIPAA-protected transaction, okay? We don't want to reveal your medical records. In fact, the fine for revealing your medical records would bankrupt us, considering we get 20,000 of these things a day, right? We'd be broke in about a month and a half. So what we do is protect that data, right? And then that goes for tax records, that goes for a number of other things that people, frankly, probably wouldn't want revealed, you know, and that not wanting it to be revealed is enshrined in statute or regulation, so we respect those statutes and regulations. Moreover, how are we using it, I think, is extremely important. If you're talking about snooping on an individual for the sake of snooping on them because you just want to kind of sell them more stuff or whatever, right, or you know, tax them more heavily or whatever, you know, that's one thing. It's another thing if we're using it to try to make sure that our buildings are greener, that our energy footprint is smaller, so that, you know, we don't have to pay, maybe we'll pick a different kind of pavement for that kind of road. or frankly to try to save your life in emergency circumstances, or where are we going to build now that we had Hurricane Sandy and we have a different floodplain to play with. So I think as long as we are as radically transparent with the public as we are now capable of being with ourselves, we should be okay in terms of the balance between privacy and efficiency.
So that's actually one angle, but there's another separate issue here with is not just necessarily transparency, but once you start correlating some of these data sets that are open and you have the ability to do so, it doesn't take many points of information about a person to identify who they are, Absolutely. Even if you anonymize. So these are things that IBM deals with, and more broadly on the transparency issues. So Florence and then Ruth Bay, maybe you could speak to this.
Sure, we actually have a system that Big Insights, we used to call it G2, you know what G2 is, where you can actually correlate different pieces of data. And actually, where this came from was a company that we bought, and the gentleman, Jeff Jonas, who runs it, actually was in Las Vegas, and he actually works with a lot of the casinos so that they can triangulate to identify when they have a card counter that just goes from J.R. Smith to John Smith or Jack Smith, or there's somebody who actually works at the casino that has the same address as this person. So there is some information that might be public that you could use, and there's private information. But what I think is that there's going to, as people understand how this data is available and how it might be used, there is going to be some awareness kind of discovery, and it could be that there are more regulations as we move forward. There are some judges who are actually hearing cases about this. I know I found one a few years ago when we started talking about metadata, and metadata is data about data. And so there was actually, I think it was a judge in Arizona that said that metadata about public data is public metadata. So there are some issues like that I'm sure you get to deal with in New York City. But there is a lot of opportunity to leverage the information for the good. To find where somebody is if they do have a medical emergency, to use the information to reduce energy use or water use. And in some of those cases, it's just like when, with utility, they said, oh, you can get this setback thermostat for free. You're like, oh, no, I'm okay. I'll just open the windows, right? You opt in. So in some of these situations, you can opt in, and if you do, you can get benefits from it. So as people start seeing that more and more, then I think they'll have more wisdom and be able to choose.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think people are obviously willingly giving up a lot of their personal information so that they can get better services, and I think it does speak to the radical transparency idea, which is, if people know how their data is being used, what data is being used, who's in charge of it, what are the privacy and security policies that a company or government has, then they're informed, and they can complain, they can challenge, they can go to meetings, they can elect people who agree with them better. So I think the transparency is a huge issue. I do think that as we talk a lot with governments, one of the things we talk about with governments is you need to collaborate across departments, you need to think about consolidating your information, making it semantically consistent, sharing it. That does put a lot of centralized power in the hands of all levels of government. And so I think there are significant issues around security and privacy. Security is closely linked to privacy because we're getting cyber attacks and security issues all the time. So I think it actually is a broader discussion which involves beyond the city limits, and it involves the international scope. New York City might have a very good governance process and privacy process for how it deals with information. But depending on maybe the technology they're using, that could be internationally based, or the data that could be shared, other cities and areas might have different policies. So it gets a little complicated. And I think the result is that we see really a lot more money being directed towards information management, security, privacy, and governance over time within organizations. It's going to take a lot more of their budget to manage these issues because they're pretty complicated.
Great, I guess. So Simon, we heard a bit about, and I think a lot of people have heard about the potential of data analytics to solve and address a lot of these problems, but we're just slowly starting to see kind of cities actually adopt this. So we talked a bit before about the cool work you're doing with Formula One, but you also mentioned a data strategy, and how could you see that translating from how you advise some of your corporate clients into some of the city and government work that an approach on how to handle all this information and make sense of it?
That's a great question. We're probably biased, but we're sort of fully paid up members of Michael Chu, who's one of the directors of the McKinsey Global Institute, who talks about data now being as a sort of as an important factor of production as human talent and physical asset. It's an absolutely kind of key resource. And just to kind of maybe build, if it's not too cliched, on the analogy that we had earlier on today, where if you like, the network is electricity. We really see, and it's a bit cliche, but the data is the new oil. And so helping firms, organizations make sense of that raw asset. Oil itself is kind of not that valuable in its raw form, but when it gets processed, it turns into kind of great value. And so there's absolutely a kind of a raw resource there that is to be used. In terms of turning it into actually improving decision making and strategy, we are great believers that you kind of have to strive continuously for the human touch. So it's absolutely important to be able to define what your purpose is. So in Formula One racing, when we first started working with them, they were saying, well, great, how can you make our car go faster? And talking to them, we said, that's kind of like the wrong question. Actually, the question is, how do you win races? And so focusing absolutely on what the strategic intent is and what the purpose is, that drives and frames the analytics and the data that you can use. The other kind of key leg is to really think about the design or the narrative of that data. So if you've got a kind of a strong strategic purpose, you can bring fantastic new techniques, algorithms, analytics to solve that. But if you don't have a strong narrative to be able to explain to the decision maker what that is, why that's important to them, and what do they do about it, you're kind of spinning your wheels. So from our perspective, it's really important to think about this not just as a sort of slightly geeky sort of analytics data thing, but actually think about it as a much more holistic, multi-skilled discipline of strategy, analytics, and design. And when you bring that together, you can start and apply that to multiple sectors. And I think cities absolutely need to be thinking in those sorts of terms.
That's great. So that raises another question I have for you. But after this one, we'll take some questions from the audience. So please start thinking of those. So you raised the issue of kind of data as commodity, and what we see, the cusp emerged in New York City out of an initiative by the Bloomberg administration, among other things, to increase economic development, bring in startups, bring in new talent. So how important is that aspect of access to information, data to cities going forward in terms of not only optimizing operations, but thinking about economic growth and this kind of innovation part of it? So Florence, you're nodding your head, so
yes,
please.
I'm so interested in this. So a number of years ago when I started working in this energy environment space, I found this study called Smart 2020. McKinsey was involved in it in BCG. And it said that better leverage of information and communications technology could drive $1 trillion a year in energy savings by 2020. I said, wow, how cool is that? Now, how much of that is there now? And how many of those solutions do we have now? There's so much opportunity to do more with this. And the city and the universities can help as well. As an example, at CUNY, they have a class, smarter operators for smarter buildings. So as you put more of this intelligence into the system, you kind of go from as I say, from a wrench to an iPhone. So you're getting information interactively to say, well, now go over and fix this while you're in that building on this side of campus. So there are opportunities to teach people this. There are opportunities for startups. There are opportunities to leverage data in new ways, as Simon was talking about. So I think that these green jobs, there are many aspects to them. It could be teaching people more, about the materials that we need now. Material science has been around for a while, but there are so many new things we could do. One of the things I say is what I would love is to, at some point, when I pick out a car, not pick the color, but pick the coating that actually brings in enough solar energy to let me drive 1,000 miles. So, think of things like that. Think of the innovation that we can bring, and think of all the new jobs that can be created that need to be invested in. But, people say, oh, we're so far from that. I say, well, you know what? If we didn't invest in the automotive industry the way we did, we'd still all be cranking our cars like this and going like this instead of having a windshield wiper. Look at the Tesla, look how far we've come. And so it's that type of investment and that type of innovative focus that we need.
I actually think too that cities can be a really important platform for innovation because they're the only ones that can combine access to accurate sort of data if they open their data sources up, as well as having a policy side to it. So you can combine the two. And I think actually New York, and you probably know more than I do about this, is really interesting because opening data isn't really that interesting, right? I cover smart cities, and I am bored to death by the data sets that are online. No one wants to use them except maybe developers who can provide really interesting services for the city. And when you combine that with a open data strategy like New York has, and you have hackathons and challenges, and you maybe gamify some of the incentives for people to keep using this open data, then you really are opening up a platform for innovation for the city, and you're driving startup growth and entrepreneurship, and cities are unique because they do have that policy side. So I think that's a really interesting aspect.
I think sorry, just to jump in on that, there's a couple. I mean, I absolutely agree. It's interesting because I think the Open Data Initiative, certainly we're seeing it in London, and I think Isabel said that they might be closing down the government, the City Hall website, because there's a bunch of other smaller firms that are kind of doing a better job of bus tracking, patterns in health data, splicing that with sports and what have you. So that I think absolutely that's generating new companies, but it's also, and I think quite critically, introducing a new culture and a new skill set into a city, and it's one that cities are going to have to compete on, understanding data. We talked earlier about there being a digital divide in society, and we were interviewed by The Economist the other week, who asked me a great question saying, do we believe that the same thing exists in organizations, i.e. a data divide? Organizations that can use data and organizations that don't. Is that going to exist? And the slightly scary answer was, we think that probably already exists.
Absolutely.
And two other points, just to kind of sort of build on that, I think also the data allows you to solve problems that you couldn't solve before. We've witnessed, I mean, you've seen in the cities, new materials, new engineering systems, being able to do things that you couldn't do before. But we've witnessed absolutely on Crossrail new data science that actually answers the problem in a very different way. Takes out 20% of their instrumentation and monitoring costs and enables them to do actually solve the problem in a different way. And finally, it's not all kind of, we've also talked about the sort of vibrancy of the city. And using, one of our interesting areas at the moment we're exploring is using data, not just as the kind of cold hard fact and decision making, but actually using data as part of entertainment. And you guys over here in the States are fantastic at watching sports with lines and infographics flying all over the place. And that adds to the entertainment and adds to the debate down at the pub afterwards. But we've witnessed, for instance, people taking master copies of albums and taking a data signature of those and being able to remaster them to be able to play them as if it was in the Sydney Opera House or the Royal Albert Hall or Carnegie Hall. And that becomes data as part of the entertainment and vibrancy of the fabric of the city as well, which I think is a fascinating area.
Great, thanks. Want to chime in on this, Mike? Or you sitting this one out?
I mean, on the open data part of it? Or just,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm also the city's, it's another one of my titles, but I'm the Chief Open Platform Officer, which is, the reason we didn't create a Chief Data Officer, frankly, was that functionality is already served to a certain degree by Rahul Merchant, our CIO. Reason we wanted an Open Platform Officer is for the very reasons you were describing, right? And it serves a multitude of policy functions. I'm really not fond of that word, but the reality is that, so we have a policy, all policy is what choices are you making, right? And so we choose, to a certain degree, to be extremely transparent to the citizenry. So there's a good government part of this. People keep us honest, right? We have a certain, when you have an evidence-based decision-making regime, which frankly is what the Bloomberg administration has been for the last dozen years, the way to keep that in place, one way to keep that in place is to let everybody know what we're doing, and then the public keeps the subsequent administration honest by doing the same, tracking that we do. But the other way about it is, or another reason we're so open about it, and the reason we use our open data so aggressively as part of our long-term strategy, is to incent schools like CUSP. It's a great thing that they're here. It's a great thing that Cornell Tech is getting built. It's a great thing that Columbia is ramping up its data science efforts. It's wonderful for the city of New York on so many levels. And that's, by feeding them not just data, but ontologies and understandings about the nuts and bolts of how we surface services, that helps them train future New Yorkers to go out and do businesses that mesh with the city, or do businesses that are tax generators, or whatever. That's great stuff. And then finally, last part of it is really, we would love to see more monetization of our data. The more that people can take data streams that come out of the city of New York, some of it, I'd say most of it, is insanely boring. But the fact of the matter is that it's that boring stuff that really kind of gets to what we do. It's not all science, and but that really kind of underlies what it is that we do as a city, and why we try to stay dynamic and growing. So the fact, if we can get people, developers specifically, and a broader community kind of saying, oh, well, that's interesting, I'll take that, and I'll tell people what services are at the library this weekend in a much more effective way than the city can. Maybe we could leverage our libraries on behalf of a truancy effort. So, it's not just, so we'd like to see our NGO community use it, we'd like to see our academic community use it, we would like to see our commercial sector use it.
Sure. Just as a quick, I think one of the ways to connect to citizens that we see really happening is mobile applications, right? And I think that's a really good point, because mobile apps, they have a really fast upgrade and software cycle, right? You're getting your upgrades on your phone for different things all the time. It's really hard for cities to maintain that, and it's 45% of the cost for these mobile applications is maintenance and support. If you can have the citizens or the nonprofits, the universities doing that for the city, they can spend their time doing other more critical things. So I think that's another important point about that.
Thanks. So I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. Yeah, Anthony.
Hi, Anthony Townsend from the Wagner School of Public Service here at NYU, which is the graduate school at NYU that teaches people how to become future government leaders. And I've been exploring these issues with my students and my colleagues over the last couple of years. And so I want to ask you guys about what you see as the risks of data-driven decision-making in government. And the reason I'm so concerned about it is because if you look at the two biggest success stories here in New York City around data-driven decision-making, they would probably be CompStat, which is the police department's now 20-year-old system of data-driven decision-making, as well as the use of 311 call data as a triage tool for basically what's wrong in the city, which Mike Flowers alluded to. And both of those data sets are really deeply flawed. There have been a lot of accusations over the last couple of years. A book that was written by two former NYPD police officers that basically, because the data drives decisions about how you record the data are getting manipulated. If anybody watched The Wire, this great celebrated series about Baltimore, they called it juking the stats, right? So you can never show an increase in crime, therefore crime has to keep going down even when it's not. And then 311, this is true in New York, it's true in Vancouver, it's true in every city that I've spoken to. 311 is disproportionately used by non-native English speakers. So if you're allocating public resources based on people who have a telephone, who think that interacting directly with government is a good idea, and not everybody thinks that, particularly in many communities that have been historically oppressed, and they are comfortable with calling in and interacting with government, then you're sort of creating a mechanism that's pushing government resources at the people who have the most resources already. They're educated, they're high income. And so, those two cases, two big success stories, really potentially harmful impacts on our system of governance. So I'd like to hear the panel respond to that.
I can tackle a couple of those just in broader sense, right? Some of the examples you gave, to be perfectly blunt, are a little simplistic, but the reality is when you say data-driven, what we're trying to do is get in a position where we're leveraging all of our data and understanding what we're supposed to do. So if you, I couldn't agree more about the 311 issue, by the way. 311 is a terrible predictor of a there being there on some things. So if I call 311 and say the light's out in the street, yeah, the light's usually out. It turns out you show up and the light's out. There's not much engineering involved in the perception of whether or not the light's out. But when you start talking about complaining about things that involve structural integrity, right? Like illegal conversion or other things, or things having to do, maybe they're dumping their trash the wrong way, that actually require some technocratic knowledge of the regulations that would form the basis of the complaint. There's, I think it's in the single digits for founded rates for some of the 311 calls. But but that doesn't mean we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Those complaints are actually extremely valuable in terms of telling us what's going on out there. If we can triage them using other intelligence that we collect or that's available, then that becomes an extremely effective resource allocation tool. Vis-a-vis playing to the test, juking the stats. I love The Wire, I think the moment you set performance metrics and cement, you're killing yourself. If those performance metrics get tied to outcomes, which are constantly evolving, because the city's constantly evolving, thank God, then you're going to be in a much better position to ensure that you're not playing to a test rather than you're delivering the outcomes that you're supposed to be delivering most effectively.
From the data, I'm sorry, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, if you don't want people to game the system, don't make the system a game.
Right.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. So from the data side, data is a key asset, right? So, and data, as we get into these data sciences, as we were talking about, you have to use data responsibly and you have to vet your data. So you have to curate the data. There are data curators. You have to make sure that the data didn't change. I think there's an opportunity in the Internet of Things to make sure that the data you're getting really is the data. Ever since, a lot of us were affected by 9/11. Ever since then, I live near a reservoir, I think, man, how do they know that the sensors that say, oh, I'm fine, are really the sensors talking back? That it's not somebody else hacking into the system and they're actually putting something terrible into the reservoir. There are opportunities that could occur. So I think about that from the information technology industry and think about ways that we can make sure that we can identify, do key authentication as an example, identification, authentication, but then there's also curation of the data. So like anything, it's what you have, but it's also what you do with it, right? So you have to make sure you're using it wisely, and you have to protect yourself and protect your data and make sure that it is actually true. And you have to be constantly vigilant. You have to stay ahead of it. And you can't stop, because the bad folks are going to try to keep on hacking it and keep on trying to make you not see what's really there. And so you have to be cognizant of it constantly. So the risk is that you just accept the data. Or the risk is that you let other people use the data in a way that really isn't appropriate. When people take information. Remember when I took statistics in college, and they were saying, well, 6 is 25% smaller than 8, but 8 is 33% bigger than 6. I'm like, that's not good. It's only 2. there's a singular difference. It's 2. So people will use the data in different ways, and you have to carefully choose what you do with the data and how people use it.
I think you bring up really, really good points, and we've done some surveys around this, and it is concerning because we found out that of the government folks that we've surveyed, 25% of them don't actually trust the data that they're using. It's in different formats, in Excel. It's hard to keep it up to date. People move, people change. So there is a concern with the fact that,
Only 25%?
What? I know, I actually thought it was a little low too, but I'm not juking the figures. I'm saying it was 25%. And at the same time, 43% of them don't actually have a data strategy. So you have to combine the two. What is your data? What is your data strategy, which leads to what the outcomes you're trying to do? And then if you don't have quality, reliable, timely data, then it doesn't matter that you're using the data if it's junk. So
just sort of 3 points on that. I can't talk to the kind of public sector and the kind of politics or the sort of that sort of side, but I can certainly talk to where we've seen it in action. And 10 years ago, you'd have a Formula One team and an engineer, and it would be a grizzled old engineer, would say, what, Monaco is a 3-stop strategy. It always has been and it always will be. When you start playing with the data, you realize it's not quite that simple. And the big thing, the teams changed because the teams that embraced the data and embraced the analytics started winning. And that, fundamentally changed the game. However, having said that, there's 3 kind of key points. One is, I think you need to embrace, you need to, particularly when you're thinking about strategy and prediction, you have to embrace the fact that it is inherently uncertain.
Right.
And therefore, not all data is created equally. You have good data and you have crap data. But it's really important to be transparent about the provenance of that data and you can build that in, you know, and you need to start and build that into your data strategy. Second point is you've got to be aware that, you know, Internet of Things, buildings are going to get smarter, machines. You know, imagine basically everything, you know, Internet of Things, and it's all got Google Analytics inside it. So I think there's a really interesting debate to be had about kind of what does machine politeness look like. And then finally, I think it's the thing is, it's not about machine says yes or machine says no. We know from our work that actually a human and a machine will always be a machine. And so we absolutely design the decision processes and the analytics that we do. There is nearly always some sort of human judgment in there to do it.
Can I just jump? I mean, I couldn't agree more, right? And so that's why I kind of reject the data-driven label to a certain degree, right? We just want better decisions. Somebody's making a decision, right? Somebody's making a choice. We're not saying we came up with an algorithm that will now convict you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay?
Precisely.
Sorry, here are the cuffs. You're off to jail. It doesn't work like that, okay? These are people making these decisions. We simply want to make them better informed. So it's not so much data-driven as I would say reality-driven. And you know, that reality is a mashup of data, and by the way, when you want to talk about garbage data, some data we get is all self-reported. And it's self-reported by people who have a certain interest in not exactly being fully informing to us about what their activities are. So you know that going in, then you do a benefit analysis on it, right? So we're embracing that we know this is crap, and then we use that, right? So the fact of the matter is, this is about informing the humans that make the decisions with the information we've got.
Which I think brings up a really interesting implementation challenge that I think I was talking to some people about last night, is that's sort of where some of this breaks down, actually, because you can have good data and it can be timely and it can inform you and cover new information, and maybe you're not going on intuition anymore, you have some interesting data. And then you have to get people to actually maybe change their behavior and respond to that data. And that's, I think, the most difficult piece. You can know that there's congestion and that you shouldn't idle your car and that you should take public transportation, you should bike, but actually getting people to do that is really challenging. So data is only one piece of it. You've got the decision maker, and then you've got the implementers and the responders too that have
behavioral change pieces is in
huge.
many ways the most interesting. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Yes, please.
Hi, Peter Miskovich, Jones Lang LaSalle, great panel. My question involves urban resilience and adaptation. And those of us who have studied aftermath, Superstorm Sandy, Florence brought up 9/11, Boston terrorism attacks. What is the thoughts from the panel around resilience, real-time data? How do we use this to protect citizenry, improve resilience, given the volatility and disruption that we've all seen over the past few years?
I think that's it. You want to go first?
I mean, Sandy in many ways was a seminal event for the use of information to handle, to get more resilient, right, for New York City. So, and by that I mean we were on the phone or in person with the mayor every day trying to give him a sense of what's going on out there from October 29 through February, right? And so the use of data meant, New York City wasn't hurting for resources. Not only did we have this wonderful volunteer community that came out, and we had some wonderful corporate partners that ponied up, but we also have, as I said, 300,000 employees. So, and every one of those dropped everything and jumped out. Those multiple pieces of information, right, at first were extremely difficult to synthesize into a story about what's going on. It's one thing to be able to say, we picked up 1.3 million cubic yards of trash, or debris, excuse me. We had 150,000 structures impacted. We had, about 100,000 businesses impacted. FEMA's on the ground doing what it's doing. National Guard is here. OEM is doing what it's doing. The police department's keeping the streets. We had the fire department fighting a fire in 60-mile-an-hour wind in Breezy Point, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we learned from that, and we learned it extremely quickly, was that we needed a way to synthesize all of that information in a way that told us we need to take these resources and send them to get people back in their houses as quickly as possible. right? So it was really as much a targeting exercise as it was a learning exercise for us. So that now, as a result of that, very quickly, and thanks to a lot of wonderful, the fact that everybody learned their lesson, not just the city, you know, we partnered up very, very closely with Con Ed and LIPA in a way that respects, you know, privacy concerns. We just simply wanted to know on/off for each building, who's on, who's off, and then we can back out residential unit counts, right? And that'll identify for us where the largest quantum of humanity lives, so we fix that place first, right? And then there's a chain of events that has to happen for that place to get fixed, so that the Department of Buildings can issue its birth certificate, known as a certificate of occupancy, which means you can go back safely, turn the lights on, and it's not going to blow up, right? So, you know, we are very aggressively using our data, and not just our data, but our partners' data and the citizenry's data. It's another example, and this kind of merges with the cloud approach, by the way, is that the city speaks a language called BIN-BBL, Building Identification Number / Borough Block and Line. So it's a structure on a tax lot. And if we can't translate intelligence into that, then we don't understand it. We can't have it drive resources, right? But everybody speaks different languages, and it has different ontologies. But now we're putting that convention out in the cloud. It's going to cost us $8 grand. You know, that's nothing. But because now it's out and the public can use it, some enterprising, hopefully, you know, company or person or whatever can now come up with an app next time, so that, you know, we have this wonderful citizenry coming out of the woodwork to help us, and we'll be able to ingest that information and do something with it. Oh my God, there's 6 people in wheelchairs over at this place in the Rockaways. We got to get there now, right? So those are the kinds of things that we have learned from Sandy. Sandy was, I would say, the most powerful lesson we could have learned about how important it is to get our arms around what we know.
That's a great example. And as I think of the things we could do in the future is taking all this data and then doing predictive analytics, right? What could occur? And then thinking of how you can communicate with the citizenry more effectively. So things I think about is, you know, when there's a water main break, which happens every now and then in a nice old strong city like ours. So there's a water main break, there are sensors so you know what's happening. It goes into an intelligent operations center, which is like what we do in Rio, a place like that, where you bring all the data together. The fire department is notified, you know, the folks that have to fix it are notified. Let's say a tweet goes out to the people who work in that area, the employees of the companies who say that they have people in that area, maybe the residents of that area. Maybe it goes onto some type of bulletin board site or a blog site or Tumblr, or, you know, there are ways that you can actually take this information and then improve efficiency in the city, improve citizen, you know, happiness in the city, make it safer, reduce some of the traffic congestion issues, different things like that. So using it very practically to save lives, get people in their houses, it's wonderful that we do that. Now we can even think about maybe making things work more easily, making it more convenient for people. So I think there are many things, you know, that we can do looking into the future.
So I think that we're just about out of time. Actually, we're past time, I think. So you know, the potential is tremendous, and I think what you've heard from the panel and also from kind of representatives from the other discussions, the other panels, the other speakers, that we're in many ways at the tip of the iceberg, and we're starting to see this roll out within cities much more aggressively. And we're actually starting to see quick wins, and this being embedded in city government, which is also very promising. Thank you all for a great discussion, so please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.